Hi everyone, and welcome to our third and final webinar series, which is co-presented with advisory firm Kepios. And once again, I am joined by Simon Kemp, founder of Kepios. So this webinar series has been all about sharing practical tips and thought starters when using GWI data, with some broader lessons for looking at data in general. Now, in the first episode, we talked about how GWI data is harmonized, and by that we mean that you can compare countries, audiences, and behaviors in a like-for-like way, and therefore you can benchmark those behaviors in a really, really useful way to get some unique perspective. In the second webinar, we focused on getting a 360-degree view of the consumer, all from a single source of data. And throughout the data stories and the examples that we covered in those webinars, one of the main messages that we wanted to convey was this: understand your data, understand the methodology, think about what that data can tell you, and think about what that data can't tell you. The world is a very complex place, and there are different ways to measure it, so you can't just rely on one data source to give you the full picture. You need to compare data sources. And that's exactly what we're doing today. This webinar is about comparing GWI data to other data sources. But before we can even think about comparing our data to other data sources, we need to take a step back and be very clear on three things. Firstly, like I said, we need to ask ourselves what our data does and does not tell us. Secondly, we need to be very clear on what is being measured before we can compare. And thirdly, we need to be very clear on what we want to compare in the first place and why we want to compare in the first place. So beginning with that first one, understanding the data, one of the most important observations about GWI data is that it is consumer survey data, meaning we measure what other people tell us. And that adds a very important human layer to the data because basically answers can be open to interpretation and therefore quite subjective. And we would call that active data. That differs a lot from what we would call passive data, which is data passively collected on individuals, for example, through first-party cookies or third-party cookies, or also spend data, spend volume data. So we'll discuss this a bit more later, but straight off the bat, we know that GWI data shines light on the more human, subjective side of things. And put simply, it measures people, not devices, whereas passive data often measures devices and not people. So with that being said, we need to think about who this represents and when it's, who the data represents, and also when that data was in field before we compare two data sources. So GWI data is collected every single quarter. It covers 50 different countries, and we interview internet users aged 16 to 64. Now that makes a big difference because an online population in some countries can be different to its total population. Not everybody is online, especially in fast growth markets in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Asia. So it's a really important thing to note about who this data represents. So before we even look at the other sources, we know that GWI data measures people. We know it's specifically about internet users aged 16 to 64. It's collected quarterly and it's global. Now we need to think about what exactly is being measured. It really doesn't end there because we need to keep a very, very keen eye and be an absolute stickler for what is being measured. Just because you're researching the same topic, it doesn't mean to say that you're measuring the same thing. For example, take spend volume data, which is obviously tracks from people using their credit cards and other plastic cards. That data is very, very useful. And also when you couple it with, for example, what we have in GWI data, which is basically people telling us that they have bought these products in the last month, and you start to get slightly different stories looking at the same thing. And obviously with the consumer survey data that we use, and even when you want to compare that to other consumer survey data, you need to be very, very clear on the question wording as well, because like I say, it's open to interpretation. It can be quite subjective, and you can be talking about exactly the same topic, but ask it in a different way and you can get different answers. So you need to have a very, very critical lens on you when you're comparing data sets. And finally, and this is where I'm really hand over to Simon for a bit, we need to think about why we would compare data in the first place. So Simon, this is where I wanted to get your thoughts because you've shown me some really, really cool things in the past about how you compare data. And we can get into the specifics of the examples a bit later, but I was wondering if you could just take us through some of the core reasons why you would want to compare data in your role.
Yeah, so this session is called Seeing Data in 3D, and I think it is exactly that. It's the multi-dimensionality that you can get when you've got data from different sources. So I think it's fairly obvious from the work that I do and all the stuff that I talk about that I'm a massive fan of GWI data. Typically, it's where I start. But even within the GWI sort of world, once you start looking at certain kinds of metrics, you realize that there's going to be additional elements to the story that a human survey simply cannot answer. And it's really useful to have those additional data points, either to confirm whether or not your hypotheses are true, or to provide a valuable counter-argument to some of the things that you might want to discuss, whether it's with your own colleagues, whether it's with your clients, whoever else it may be. So quite often, even if I know that the answer that I'm getting from GWI is exactly what I'm looking for, I will look for an additional data point, either to support it or just to provide a different element so that the client has something to shoot down if that's the kind of client that they are. So yeah, 3 dimensions. I think the more dimensions you can have, the greater the variety of your data sources, the more robust your takeaways from the data are going to be.
Yeah, 100% agree. I feel like kind of that basic truth that one single source of data can't tell you everything. For me, it kind of gives us 3 core things which I want to do run through in today's session. Firstly, I find that it can enhance your understanding of a topic. I guess the most basic one, really. But secondly, it also fills the gaps. You know, like I said, you need to be very understanding of what your data can and can't tell you, and the things that it can't tell you might be able to find through a different data methodology. So that's another one. But also it can sometimes help you completely reframe your understanding of a topic. You know, you're seeing something in the data, you can't explain it, you look at another data source and it basically has pulled the rug out from under what you thought that might be. And that's where I think really that comes from the contradictions between data sets. It's a very inconvenient thing to find when, you know, 2 data sets are saying completely different things. But actually, if you put the work in, quite often you can get a really, really amazing sort of reframe of the topic you're looking at.
Yeah, I think embracing those differences is something that I've sort of become a lot more comfortable with. When I first started looking at data, I was terrified when 2 different sources gave me a contradictory answer, because I thought that meant that you couldn't trust either of them, whatever else. I kind of learned now that it is that 3D view. You know, it's that terrible apocryphal story of the 3 blind guys trying to work out what an elephant is by touching different parts of its body. I think a lot of the time we end up with that in the data world. The numbers that we find are reflective of a very specific dimension of the story that we want to understand, and actually seeing them together, sometimes those contradictions tell us exactly what we need to know, as long as we are comfortable with a bit of ambiguity and difference. That takes a little bit of training. I think, you know, when I say training, it's a lot of that is your own personal journey as a data analyst, just learning when something is different and bad different versus good variations, and how you can use those to construct a much more robust story. But yeah, I think that the key takeaway from that little ramble is don't be afraid when data sources differ. It doesn't necessarily mean a bad outcome. It could in fact result in a much better series of interpretations.
I can completely empathize with that. I mean, even, you know, 5-6 years ago when I was looking at data, when I would find the contradictions, quite often it would be the end of the road for me, and, you know, I'd try and pursue a different angle. But yeah, like I say, it's definitely something which can yield much better results for you if you put the time in. So I was running, maybe one of the first examples we can start with has been about Twitter uses in Japan. And this is something you've talked at great length about. So I'll try and find the right slide to put up. But maybe if we could start talking about that one.
Yeah, so I think whichever data source you look at, whether it's Twitter's own data, whether it's GWI data, whether it's third-party analysis, you're going to find some quite significant difference. So this is global Twitter use. We can talk about the Japan-specific stuff in a minute, but whichever source you look at in here, it tells you a very different story about how people, well, first of all, how many people use Twitter, but also how they're then using the platform. So in its earnings announcement, and apologies, these are data, those data points we just saw are from the July earnings announcement. They're going to be publishing their new numbers this evening, UK time, Europe time, so overnight for me in Singapore. But Twitter will be doing its earnings announcement tonight. So that 238 figure that you see on the left-hand side will hopefully change in some direction as a result of this evening's updates. 238 is the monetizable daily actives that Twitter reports. It's a very useful number for investors because it basically tells you how many of its users Twitter is able to earn revenue from. Fantastic if you're an investor. But if you're a marketer, the second number under the green circle there is the one that may be more interesting to you. And that's the number of users that you can reach with ads each month on Twitter. As you can see, it's quite a lot bigger, and we're almost double in fact, we are more than double. Terrible maths. We're more than double the monetizables that you can see in there. Obviously, these are monetizable, but this is a monthly figure rather than a daily figure. When you look at the number of distinct devices visiting twitter.com, however, you can notice that's the third figure in there. Massive, massive difference, huge increase. And what's critical about that number is that it includes people who are not logged in to Twitter. So, they've not either created an account or signed into their account. And that tells us a lot more about the potential reach of content on Twitter. And then finally, on the right-hand side there, we've got, this is the number from the GWI survey. This is based on when you're asking people across the entirety of the GWI survey base whether they use Twitter, regardless of whether they sign in, regardless of how they use it. And you can see, again, that's a big, hefty figure compared to even the sort of the first two. So even in response to what seems like an incredibly straightforward question of how many people use Twitter, each of these numbers here is a perfectly valid number, and none of them is wrong or right. They're just different responses to how you want to cut that data. So that is even, I know that you were wanting to talk about the Twitter use in Japan, Chase, so I'll hand it back to you at this point to start off with some of the insights that you'd pulled out from that. But this gives us a great context about which to talk about Twitter generally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what we wanted to talk about with the Japan example was, and we've talked about this in actually the previous session we've done of this, and we consistently draw on Japan because quite often it's one of the more extreme examples in our survey. Yeah. And you can often learn the most, from those extreme examples. But with the Twitter in Japan thing, Twitter's very popular in Japan, but the way that people use the internet in Japan is they might not necessarily want to fully disclose their own either personality or their full identity. Now, Twitter obviously allows people to use anonymized handles, and we see this as a very popular activity in Japan. But also in Japan, we find that what people tell the platforms is their gender or other parts of their identity might not actually be a true reflection of their identity. Mm. And then because of that, we actually find that there's sometimes differences between the Twitter audience profile we see and the Twitter audience profile that other data sources see. And Simon, this is something you've covered a few times, isn't it?
Yeah, so I find it fascinating. I think it's not because, so just for the folks tuning in today, Chase and I are not intended to give you a deep dive understanding of Twitter users in Japan. The reason why we're choosing this as an example is because Chase and I, in our private conversations, have spent an inordinate amount of time looking at some of these numbers and asking each other, what is going on here? Can you work out why this is happening or what this set of numbers means? I mean, you've probably noticed by now, we're quite nerdy. This is just one of those things where, because perhaps we're outsiders, so neither of us is necessarily an expert in Japanese culture or anything else. So we're looking at these almost just from the lens of data. And hopefully that is a useful perspective for you guys tuning in today as well to make sense of this. The Twitter stuff, we've done an analysis of that for a bunch of different clients up in Japan, so Japanese brands and investment community as well, to understand why the Japanese usage behaviors are so different. And it comes back to this idea of using avatars that you alluded to. So not necessarily representing every aspect of your personality in the way that you use a platform. So what's really interesting is especially in sort of Western countries like the US and Europe, there's this sort of movement recently to demonstrate your authentic self in a lot of your online activity. Whereas in a lot of Asian countries, actually, there's this sort of, you represent different elements of still who you are, but you represent it in different ways in different platforms at different times. And that's fascinating as an anthropologist, as somebody who looks at these kinds of data points to say, okay, what can I learn about what this means? When we look at Twitter use in Japan, I mean, your GWI data, which looks at individual human beings saying, do you use it? We see a very high level of adoption. So it's clear that individuals are using Twitter regularly and in high numbers in Japan. But when you start looking at the active user accounts in Japan, the numbers are even bigger. And part of that is because some people may actively manage 2 or 3 different profiles depending on which element of their personality they want to engage with. Now, as a marketer, that's not a bad thing. Just because you've got higher user numbers doesn't mean that you're diluting your budget. If I can specifically reach one of my target audience at a moment when they are in their happy and entertainment mode, then I'm able to sell them a particular kind of product or service. But if they're in a business mode, for example, I want to sell them something different. And actually being able to identify those different parts of somebody's life has quite a lot of value. It means that I can be a lot more targeted in my activities. So don't necessarily see that as a dilution or a bad thing. Chase, at this point, it might be worth just bringing up those gender numbers, if we can show those, because I think this is one of the key differences in data that we see. And I want to stress as we pull this up, guys, the numbers are quite different, but neither of them is wrong or right. So the numbers that Twitter reports in its ad planning tools, which are on the left, are based on inferences of active user accounts. And as I mentioned, those active user accounts may be quite a lot higher than the unique individual users. Some of those accounts may represent and identify as being one particular gender rather than another, even though the person managing that account identifies or represents as a different gender. So it gets doubly complicated when you start looking at this. But you can see on the left-hand side of the chart there, we've got the data from Twitter's ad planning tools, which shows quite a strong skew towards male identifying audiences. When you look at GWI's survey responses, which is where the human individual is saying, yes, I use Twitter on a regular basis, you'll notice that it's actually a lot more sort of balanced, if you like. The numbers are a lot more similar. Like I said, both of these are useful. Neither of them is wrong or right, and they allow us as marketers and as observers to take a very different view of what's happening on Twitter. But yeah, Chase, you've been studying quite a lot of the nuances of that use. So I'll pause there and let you give a little more color into how you've identified those behaviors as well.
Well, I think one thing you mentioned there actually is really kind of struck a chord, and that is about how you sort of look at this data. Both of these pieces of information from both data sources are incredibly useful. But I guess it just depends on how your sort of frame of reference and what you expect to get from your data. The world is not a clear-cut place at all. And no data source is going to give you full visibility over that. And also no data source is necessarily going to tell you exactly how something is. Sometimes it can be more of a hint or a clue. You know, for example, in this case, you've got that extra human layer, which is about the desire for anonymity and using social media and online sort of platforms to be able to express themselves in ways that they wouldn't necessarily be able to do in real life. And I think that's a really strong example of how we need to sort of rethink how we use data sometimes. Rather than seeing it as something to shed light on a black and white world, it can sort of reveal shades in different places, and we can put these pieces of information together to actually suddenly have that eureka moment, you know, because if you're looking at the numbers on the left here, you might just take that for granted and think that's fine. Or if you didn't know that it was sort of an anonymized usage thing going on, then, you know, it could lead you down a completely different path. But having the two sources together can really, really reveal something completely new and unexpected.
Yeah, so I didn't include it on this chart, but just to give you another perspective. So the traffic data that we get from SEMrush, which it's the thing you were talking about before, it's measuring devices. So again, there's going to be an extra layer of complexity to that data. But interestingly, it sits halfway between these two. So it's got a little bit more of a. So I've not included the gender bits on here, but you can see that. So SEMrush does include figures for unique device visits to twitter.com and a variety of other websites here. Automatically your eyes will be drawn to the adult entertainment viewers. I know that's going to happen. I'm going to bring you back to Twitter. Focus on Twitter. What's really interesting about those three dimensions, though, is that depending on what you're trying to do, you can use each of those different data sources to help you make a better decision. And I think this is what's critical here is data doesn't always tell you an answer. It gives you elements that you can use like ingredients when you're a chef. You can create lots of different dishes using exactly the same set of ingredients depending on what you want to do with them. And as a marketer and as an analyst, that's exactly what you are. You're a data chef. You're looking at what dishes you want to concoct with the stuff that you have at your disposal and the outcome that you want to deliver with that. And I think one of the recommendations that we give to our clients up at Japan based on that Twitter data is not so much that you need to be using the exact gender profile data of the platforms for your targeting. Maybe what you want to do is take a step back and say, actually, I'm not going to use demographics because they're quite complex. Rather, I want to look at more contextual targeting, or I want to look at targeting at particular times of day even. So rather than using a traditional kind of marketing approach where you're taking those, to be honest, what are a little bit outdated in terms of the way that we approached it. You know, demographics are sometimes a little bit less relevant in a social media world because we've got other ways of looking at that data too. They still provide value. You know, comparing younger versus older users is incredibly useful, but sometimes it's not exactly the only set of data you want to use. So yeah, I think, you know, take the data points, use it to inform the decisions that you're trying to make. I think, Chase, this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of what's the question that you're trying to answer as an analyst, and therefore what are the right data points to provide that answer.
Yeah, and I think with this slide, we can sort of think back to what we were talking about with understanding what your data does and does not tell you. If we think about GWI data, it tells us the human perspective. But obviously, sometimes there's a difference between what people think and what they say. Now, that's not a problem. There can obviously be a lot of insight in between what people think and what they say, and you can start to unpiece the sort of deeper things there. But also, it doesn't tell you the exact number of times that something has happened, with absolute certainty. But if you look at this data, for example, our data tells us that on average, people are accessing the internet on about 3 different devices. So someone going on Google, you don't know if that's someone or someone else in their household, right? And when we think about targeting online as well, and this is something which the LinkedIn B2B Institute has covered a lot, the accuracy of targeting online, not just because people are on different devices, but also because the sort of assumptions and the inferences that are made, sometimes the probability of those being correct can be quite interesting. I definitely recommend people to follow up on that with the LinkedIn B2B Institute. But it's a good example of where the gaps are in different data sets and how you can piece those together by comparing completely different methodologies.
Exactly. And I think, Chase, this is another great example of the importance of 3D. So you take one data point on its own and you're seeing something in a very one-dimensional world. You take 2 and you end up with some what is potentially conflict. As soon as you add a third data source, you are seeing the 3-dimensional perspective. So if I just took Twitter's ad planning tool data or its earnings announcements numbers as the basis for my how many people use Twitter question, I'm going to get quite a low number. If I then compared it to GWI's much higher number, I might start to question whether GWI's number was artificially inflated. But once I start to then see this SEMrush data, I start to be able to actually realize why that GWI number is so much higher than the ad number that I'm seeing in Twitter's tools. The answer to that is the number of people that visit twitter.com without logging in so that they can read news content. I think this is, if I was Elon Musk, yes, the bots is an important story, but these are the sets of numbers I want to be looking at and going, wait a minute, because within Twitter's current business model, there's so much untapped potential. I'm not an investment professional. This is not investment advice. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying here. But the key to looking at these 3 dimensions of data is that all of a sudden you start to go, oh, wow, okay, so this versus that, these are where the data points can help me make my recommendations to my team, to my clients, make decisions as a marketer myself. So I think we've belabored this point a little bit, but hopefully that gives you a perspective on why we chose this as an example. There are so many dimensions to this one particular data point, this one particular activity. And the good news is you can apply those learnings to pretty much any other aspect as well, especially when it comes to social media.
Yeah. And moving from this sort of web traffic data approach, I think it's a nice segue into the next topic we're going to talk about, which is something which really does sort of allow us to see a completely different perspective than many other more passive tracking tools. And that is when we're talking about VPN usage. So this is very pertinent right now. With the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen some huge changes in the country rankings of VPN usage. So I'll just pull up 2 slides here to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So this is pre-invasion country ranking of VPN usage. Now, Russia is in 40th place. If we skip now to post-invasion, and this is regular VPN usage, so
holy shit,
Russia goes straight to first.
Goodness.
Now, this is not something, and this is not something which passive data techniques can usually pick up, and has huge implications for other parts of people's online lives. What we find is that not only in Russia has there been an increased desire from people to want to keep up what's going on in the world, but obviously we've got them shooting to top, ranked first in VPN usage, regular VPN usage. But also we're seeing Western news services see upticks for Russian internet users. That's something which is very difficult to capture with other data sources. Now, this is a pretty simple one, and we get a lot of questions about contradicting data sources sometimes, and 99% of the time it comes down to what we've already talked about, measuring a different thing or a different time period or whatever. But the VPN usage sometimes is yeah, it's a really, really interesting example of why active data can be really, really a good complement to passive data.
Yeah, I think when it comes to things like this, where people may be a little bit reticent of telling you an answer, or they may be overexcited about giving you an answer, I think comparing survey responses to other kind of collective data as well, you start to see, you start to get a sense of whether people are telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the answers that they give you, or whether the device data is being massively overinflated by multiple devices or through nefarious activities and whatever else. But Chase, that kind of that difference in the space of how long was that? What, 6 months?
That's about 6 months, 6 to 9 months.
Incredible. I mean, that level of change, that kind of. So I just saw the comments coming in. Considering we're talking about VPN, that's hilarious. Johnny, you could probably kill those comments coming in on YouTube there. So I think, trying to make sense of what your question is to start with, I think is one of the things that I find most difficult as an analyst. So when somebody says to me, so for example, it might be, tell me about VPN usage, they come with a fairly broad blanket question coming in. It's when you start to then look at those multidimensional sets of data, you can start to tell a story that is going to help both you and your stakeholders to make those better decisions. But when you saw this, Chase, did you take it at face value, or did you go off and look for other data sources as well?
I found this last night, so I didn't exactly
put you on the spot with that one. So
it's something which I'm going to definitely follow up on, and that's an enormous change in this sort of space.
It is. Folks tuning in on the session today, if you've got any perspectives on that, or if you want to sort of ask questions around that specific one or anything else we're talking about, Chase and I will be taking questions as well. So just put them in the comments, and we will do our best to answer all pertinent questions as we go through the stream today.
But there's actually something else with the VPN usage which we've often got questions about. So we ask social media usage across the world. In some countries, as you know, some social media services are banned, but we know in theory, we know because people tell us either through VPN usage or perhaps they have an account when they go to a different country, that lots of people in, for example, China actually are visiting some of the most popular social media services. Really, really large numbers of people, just given the fact that how big China's population is.
Exactly. And Chase, that leads to quite an interesting sort of, I suppose it's a question and a watch out at the same time, where you've got very large numbers. So a country like China, obviously, just the sheer size of the population and the share of that population that's online, you are looking at hundreds of millions of people in certain instances. Where they're using a VPN, they're going to be reflected in the tracking, so the automatic tracking, the device tracking in other countries. So if I set my VPN up that I am supposedly in the United States when I'm actually physically present in China, that's going to distort the figures for the United States as well. So this is one of the reasons why it's really valuable to use both sets of data. Again, neither's right or wrong. You're going to want to take that multidimensional view so you can construct your view of what you're trying to answer. But I think, we're seeing that so we collect, as part of our global digital report series, where we feature so many GWI data points, but we also include third-party numbers. We include a lot of data that we collect directly from the ad planning tools of the social media platforms. A lot of the times those numbers are in excess of the local total population. Something like use of VPN is a really important thing for us to look at in that particular situation. You will also find that so this is one of the most fascinating things. I was speaking to some folks from an NGO a few months back about why the numbers for Libya in particular, when it came to Facebook and Instagram usage, were so high. And they found this as hugely valuable because it gave them an indication of migrant populations for various reasons. And I'm not going to go into the politics and the stresses of this, but various migrant populations coming from sub-Saharan Africa end up in Libya in their journey to other places. And the change in the usage of these platforms over time can give you an indication of where those pressure points are building up. It becomes absolutely fascinating how you can use this kind of data. But this kind of thing of when you start to get into the VPNs where people are deliberately hiding or changing their location, as a marketer, you need to be fully aware of this because it's going to quite dramatically change your decisions if you are aware of those obfuscations.
That's right. And also when you couple that with stuff like device sharing, that results in a lot of people where, miss geoallocation, basically miss ad spend going into the wrong place. And there's already a lot of money going to waste in the ad spend space. So yeah, it's a very interesting one to look at, which is, I guess, like really sort of revealed when you're able to look at different data sources.
So I'm going to put you on the spot again because I love to put you on the spot. You know, I know it annoys you, so we have to do it while you're doing it live. Based on that chart you've got on the screen there, you said you just found it last night. So I'm just going to ask you, if you were going to give advice for people that are tuning in today, just based on that, where are you going to start looking for additional dimensions of data to try and make sense of what this means for the marketer? So, suppose a client had come to you and said, wow, that's impressive. What do we do now? What other sources of data, or even what other data points within GWI survey are you going to look at to give dimension to this?
I think I'd probably want to firstly look at media behaviors and definitely compare sort of the passive with the active,
Right.
using the active to really unpick, really what's going on with people's behaviors, because with this VPN usage, it's going to automatically drive people's online behaviors in a certain new direction. For example, what we found in Russia is people are looking for information. They want to know what's going on in the world. So that's going to basically change them and move them towards a certain direction. So you can sort of understand where that direction is going to be, use active data to understand exactly where their time is being spent. And also look at this on the broader, mindset really as well. We'll be looking at web traffic, consumer survey data, probably social listening if possible as well.
Yeah. The social listening stuff in particular often it's slightly... Social listening data, in my experience, tends to be a little bit more at the fringes. You tend not to get an awful lot of people talking about mundane things in the middle, although that's a little bit of a sweeping statement. But you will find more extreme views expressed more actively in a social media setting, because people tend not to tell you things that are boring. So do take it with a little pinch of salt, but nonetheless, it's watching change over time in those views, regardless of whether they feel a little bit more fringe. If you suddenly see a dramatic change in the volume, either up or down, then that's always a good indicator that something's happening that's worth digging into with both the active and the passive data too. So yeah, social listening, I think is massively underrated. It used to be, 10 years ago, it was a thing and it started to become much more valued, but it didn't last very long. And I think that's a real shame, because there's so much value that we can add to other data sources by bringing in those slightly more qualitative insights that you can get from social listening.
Well, a lot of our clients use GWI alongside social listening tools. They use it in different ways. And what I found social listening to be very useful for is to, point us in a direction. Sometimes when you sit in front of data, you think there are infinite possibilities of what I could look at here. Which direction do I take? And if you're looking for some sort of direction, some sort of tips, some guidance, sometimes social listening can point you in that direction.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is a very specific and niche and slightly mundane example, but one of the charts that we used to feature quite regularly in our reports, because it was always one that got shared frequently, was a ranking of the top emoji. And one of the big rises that we saw towards the end of last decade was a massive increase in the use of the recycling emoji. And of course, the immediate interpretation is, oh, this is great. This means that people are a lot more environmentally conscious, that the climate is becoming a part of conversation. When you actually coupled it with social listening data, however, you realize that it was actually just being used as I'm retweeting or resharing somebody else's content. It had nothing to do with recycling, except for recycling of content. Similarly, this skull over recent months has become a massive part of, a significant increase in the use of the skull emoji. If you were a slightly more passive reader of that data, you might think this represented a very negative undertone, but actually social listening data tells us the young folks are using the skull to mean I died laughing, and it's actually a positive, not a negative. You sometimes need that lens of seeing how it's being used in context before you can make sense of another trend. Says the old man looking at the kids going, what?
Yeah, it's definitely that human element that can catch you out, isn't it? It's something is being used in a very different context than what you thought. I just wanted to touch on quickly, you were talking about sustainability there, and it kind of jogged my memory about something which is quite interesting about comparing different survey data sources. So I do want to talk about sort of macroeconomic indicators before we close off today, but just quickly talking about the sustainability side of things. One thing we're seeing in our data, and this is a big story in our end of year trends report, telling people what's going on next year, is that sustainability is not doing very well in the consumer realm right now. It's basically losing its position in people's priorities, and we're seeing this as a very, very gradual trend line. It's happening across people's interest in environmental issues, their expectations of brands to be eco-friendly, the importance they place on helping the environment. Really, across a whole bunch of metrics, we're seeing this very steady downward slope, And it's in pretty much most of our 50 countries. It's not a coincidence. It's not just one thing going on in one place. It is fairly universal. But when you look at lots of other different consumer surveys, especially those sort of one-off ones, they often paint a very different picture. And I think this brings us to the idea that, in survey data, you can have, again, it's open to interpretation. It's subjective. It can be influenced by, social stigmas or other things going on in the world. People can sort of answer in ways that they want to answer, But actually, if I was to ask someone, do you care about the environment? Of course, they're going to say yes. When you ask millions of people over a course, the same question in many different countries over the course of 3 years, then you start to be able to read between the lines and see sort of the deeper stuff that's going on. And it's a good example of comparing, the same methodology, but in different contexts.
The bits within your data of what are you actively doing to make a difference about climate outcomes and sustainability as well, I think is one of the most interesting things. So asking me, am I interested in this? Absolutely. Do I care about the environment? Totally. What are you doing about it? Are you changing the amount of packaging you focus on when you buy a product? Or maybe not. Are you willing to pay this much more for environmentally products? Or, well, given the current outlook, this is a good segue into your next segment. But if given the current sort of economic challenges that people around the world are facing with increasing interest rates and all that kind of stuff, how much of a sacrifice are we willing to make as individuals in order to live those ideals that, if asked, we would definitely sort of support? It's that, I suppose, there's so much more, like you said earlier in today's conversation, there's so much more to the black and white questions that sometimes research asks us. And given in an idea where we would do X, but in reality, it's an awful lot more like Y and Z. So hopefully a good segue there. Chase, you were going to talk about macroeconomics. So
yeah, well, speaking of interest rates,
can you?
So this is actually something that's really interested me. How is the current sort of economic situation affecting consumers in different countries? How people feel about their personal finances, how they feel about the economy. Is it a direct reflection of the media? Is it a direct reflection of, central bank announcements about interest rates? Is it a direct reflection of inflation?
Yeah.
Really, what we find is that macroeconomic indicators, which again we're hearing a lot about right now, is very relevant right now. Sometimes in different countries, they share a strong relationship with how people feel about the economy. In other situations, they have a very lesser relationship with that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to go back to Japan because it is just such a good example in so many different ways. So let's find the right slides. Bear with me.
Okay.
So yeah, Japan makes a very, very good case study here. So what we're looking at here is the most recent inflation rate announced when I pulled this slide, and although the data is from July, so admittedly slightly different time periods, but we're seeing very similar data now. Now, if you look at those inflation rates on the right, and then compare them to how financially secure people feel, there's a bit of an odd one going on here, because
it is, isn't it?
So Japan is a really interesting example again, where they are more likely than any other country in this chart to say that they feel financially insecure right now. But when you look at their inflation rates, it's within the boundary of what a central bank would want. It's between 2 to 3%. And I think that's a really good indicator that quite often we use these macroeconomic indicators, we compare countries with them, and that's that. But there is another human layer, how people interpret and feel about their personal financial situation or their country's economy can be in stark contrast to what those macroeconomic indicators are telling us. And for a brand looking to nail the right messaging during this period of potentially recession, I think this is really, really important to make sure you absolutely consider what people are thinking here. And there's a bit of a sort of context and history behind this, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about this and something you might have looked at. Put you on the spot.
It's funny. It's exactly what we were talking about earlier. As soon as I see those numbers, I'm like, wait a minute, I need to go and get a few more dimensional aspects here. So as I've confessed already, I am a big fan of exploring anything to do with trends in Japan, just because it's so different. It's one of those things that trains my brain as an analyst, but also I love the culture and the food and everything in Japan too. So I've got double reasons. Looking at those interest rates is one thing. I think I would immediately at this point want to go off and look at things like the changing exchange rate, because I know that in Japan they've had a real challenge in terms of currency exchange. I'd also want to go and look at how tourism revenues are doing, because Japan, much as it's got an incredibly robust and broad economy, the tourism receipts are quite important, and they've been closed off for quite a long time as a country. So yeah, I mean, those are very specific to this particular chart, Chase. But I think what the whole point here is that it's not taking that data necessarily at face value, much as both of those findings and the correlation between the interest rates and how financially secure people feel, that in itself is already really interesting. But I kind of feel like you want as many dimensions to that story as you can get. And I think the point here is that you probably want to be looking at a very diverse set of data. So it's maybe not just even the core sort of macroeconomic inflationary elements, but also what else could you find? Something as daft as what's the weather been like? I know that sounds almost flippant, but having grown up in Scotland, the weather impacted my mood quite a lot as a kid. And if it was incredibly rainy, I would have answered any question negatively. So even something like that, when you're seeing trends that you can't make sense of, not clutching at straws, but going out and thinking, right, what might be an interesting set of data to look at? Beware. I'm gonna parrot one of those terrible phrases that people in the analyst community hate. Correlation is not causation, and vice versa. But nonetheless, what you are looking for are things that might be useful dimensions. I keep saying that word, don't I? Useful different angles to see this data at and see whether or not you can find other reasons why the data is the way it is and what that then means for behavior. But Chase, I think your recommendation there of you've got to have a much richer understanding as a marketer before you make sweeping statements about the context in which you think your audience finds themselves, because you can really embarrass yourself. I mean, you can do a lot of damage by getting that wrong. So use data as an illumination and not as a crutch. I'm going to use all my aphorisms today, haven't I?
Yeah. Well, something I've done with this analysis is I took the countries in question here, including a couple of European countries, and I took the inflation rates on a quarterly basis and then their economic sentiment on a quarterly basis and just did some simple regression analysis. In places like Japan, I actually don't have that chart, I'm afraid. In Japan, and in the UK, there is a very, very strong correlation between inflation rates and economic sentiment. Now, obviously, like you said, Simon, correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's still very interesting. And the interesting thing about Japan, and I'll pull up this the next slide. So Japan's economic history is really interesting. Since the 1990s, their GDP hasn't changed a great deal compared to other countries. Their inflation rates have typically been very, very low, including their interest rates. And basically, in Japan, the idea of putting prices up is quite alien compared to other places. In the past, they've seen companies increase their prices, even though there's really a complete lack of an inflationary environment. Companies increase their prices and they need to do ad campaigns to explain to consumers why they increase their prices. So it's just a much more sensitive environment to even the smallest changes, which would be considered normal in different countries. So having that cultural and contextual nuance, I think, is really, really important when looking at macroeconomic indicators.
I think as well on this one, when you look at the statement, I feel financially insecure, much as it might seem like it's quite objective because it talks about money, and money's quite it's a very tangible kind of thing. But the feeling of financial security is going to be quite a lot more subjective, and I would imagine quite cultural as well. So looking around you and seeing the impacts on other people and whatever else, I think it's going to have a very clear effect on your mood, I suppose. And that then translates into the emotion of I feel financially secure, insecure, and otherwise. But I mean, Chase, you and I could probably dissect this chart and a set of data for days by just, what about this set of data? Let's go and have a look at these numbers. And I think that's kind of where, if you want to really get into the magic of analysis and finding insights as opposed to just sets of numbers, it's that curiosity of looking at it and going, ooh, I want to know more about this. That's the bit you want to nurture. It's the bit that wakes me up early in the morning. Doesn't keep me up at night, which is nice, but wakes me up in the morning. Every time I'm going into one of these new analyses, I'm like, what am I going to find? It's like, I'm a very nerdy person. I'm not everyday person on the street. I accept that. But if you're tuning in today, there's a very good chance that you're going to be similarly nerdy, and therefore that curiosity is what you want to nurture and embrace. Don't look at this with trepidation and fear. Look at this with excitement and go, right, I want to make sense of this.
Yeah. And before we head off, because we're coming up to time, I'll just leave everyone with this chart, which is another interesting one, looking at concern about COVID-19 versus case rates during Britain's second wave and India's second wave. It just shows that the stuff that you might hear in the news, that sort of objective, widespread metrics of understanding the world around us, can be very much at odds with how people are feeling. So
yeah,
again, just sort of fun reminder of knowing that there is always that human element which can be teased out using different data sources, but the human element needs to be considered with, for example, looking at the actual hard metrics here.
Yeah, there's a couple of bits that this makes me think of. So first of all, whenever you see a stat given in isolation, whether it's in the media or in a presentation or whatever else, always do your due diligence, look for at least one more, if not two more data points that will either corroborate or completely destroy the stat. This is especially pertinent at the moment when you see things in the media, like a certain social media platform maybe dying or whatever else. I see endless headlines in my social feeds about the fact that these platforms may be dying, written by relatively respectable media outlets. Because I spend my life living in the data around those platforms, I know that those stories are based on a very selective reading of one single data point. And while they're not necessarily wrong data points, the interpretation that is then given of that data point is wildly exaggerated. So figures like this, it's exactly what you were saying, Chase. You may look at what's being reported in the media at a particular time, but then when you try and relate that back to people's everyday lives and what's really going on in the world, they don't necessarily match up. So lies, damn lies, and statistics is still a perfectly true statement. Hopefully we've got beyond that classic. So there's a comedian in the UK called Vic Reeves who said that 88.2% of stats are made up on the spot. And that's just one of my favorite things to quote to people who give me random statistics out of nowhere. He's absolutely right. Most statistics are made up on the spot. So what you really want to do is not be that person. When you're going to make a statement to somebody that involves objective proof, use GWI, use your third-party data sources as well. Build that multidimensional perspective of the data, of the behavior, and then you can say with confidence and you can make decisions based on those inferences that are going to support you into your forward-looking activities and hopefully set you up better for the future too.
Yeah, and embrace contradictions as well.
Embrace contradictions. Definitely something I'm taking away from today. And keep your eye on how those things change over time. I think your stat there on VPN usage, I'm going to go and look at those numbers right now and dig into that. It's fascinating.
Cool. Well, thanks very much for joining us, everyone. And Simon, as always, it's been great talking to you.
Same. Look forward to our next one of these conversations, whenever that may be. Folks, if you've got any questions after today's session, if you're watching the replay, do feel free to drop those into the comments and tag us. We'll do our best to come back and answer you later. But yeah, thanks for joining us and giving us your time today. And Chase, thanks for a load of great provocations and for taking up my evening now with me going and looking at VPN data.
No worries. Cool. Thanks very much.
See you, folks.